Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Landscaping and Gardening for Wildlife with the Mass Audubon. Do you have a true green thumb? Meaning, are you taking into account the complete ecosystem around the land that you care for? We're going to learn how you can support local species by utilizing wildlife-friendly gardening practices in your home, business, and community settings. Simple, easy actions like keeping fall leaves on the ground could have huge effects and bring in more butterflies come spring. We're going to learn about what to do and not to do in your yard, garden, or even container to support nearby birds, frogs, pollinators, and in a more sustainable fashion. And this presentation is led by Tia Pinney, who's a biologist, lead naturalist, and educator at Mass Audubon's Drumlin Farm Wildlife Sanctuary in Lincoln since 1994. When she first started working at the farm, Tia has overseen efforts to maintain New England's wildlife on its 206-acre property, managing staff and volunteers in planting projects and citizen science. So all 65 of us or so who are here live, and the many more that will watch on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Tia for joining us here this morning. And Tia, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate it. Okay, so here we go, folks. We've got a number of slides to get through, and I want to get through them in time to have some questions at the end. So I'm going to mosey along, but do let Robert know if you missed something or if something needs to be repeated. You will get a link to this later that you can review if you need to. There's lots to talk about. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. So off we go. So what we're going to do for this morning, I'm so used to saying this evening, we're going to talk about what sustainability and what it is. We're going to talk about supporting our wildlife, the best practices for doing so, the role of native plants versus introduced species, the issue of lawns, and then what should you do if you feel you need or you want water, and what's the importance of water. So those are our top. That's our roadmap for the night. I mean the day. Sorry. Off we go. So first, sustainability. So that's a total buzzword right now. What is sustainability? It's a term that we hear a lot. In regards to our own, and in thinking about it in terms of a natural history, ecosystem, ecological perspective, I would say that, everything about our natural environment needs to be considered. It's living in a way that maintains the health and integrity of the environment, about, ensuring future generations of people and of wildlife and plants all have access to the natural resources that we need. And that, we're all in this boat together. Humans in balance with nature, to ensure the future. And why is sustainability so important at this point? This is, by the way, a terrific image from Charlie Harper. I don't know if you know Charlie Harper. He's an artist who died many years ago, but he was basically a naturalist himself, and he has these terrific graphic images that are just gorgeous. Excuse me. So the thing is that sustainability is important right now because of the stress that we are seeing on many of our natural systems. A few years ago, there was a release of a report that we've lost, billions of birds from North America. Probably a 30% decline in birds in Massachusetts alone, since most of us are in the Northeast here, outside of New Mexico. And likely up to a 70% decline in insects in that same time frame. The issue is that birds are much more highly counted and monitored than insects. So we don't really, the insect population is decline is not numerical. Although remember, I'm old enough to remember when I was a kid, and in the summer, the windshield would be covered with dead bugs, right? When you go out in the evening in particular, there would just be mushed bugs all over your windshield. And now, no mushed bugs, right? And that is totally an indication of the population of insects. that we don't have. Remember, people had those special covers to protect the front of their cars from insect bodies, and so it wouldn't ruin their paint. And so that alone is a very concrete indicator of a tremendous change that has evolved in the past 30 years. Most of it probably due to climate change and also loss of habitat. So those are two things that are critical at this point in terms of how we deal with the world around us. So that for today, our theme is that you can create a landscape around, in the area of land that you are responsible for, whether it's your own yard, whether it's a community, park, whether it's, the yard outside your business. I mean, some landscape outside your business. You can have a tremendous impact, even on a very small space. That dealing sustainably with your landscape supports a tremendously complex and diverse wildlife community. And the more diverse, the more biodiverse is the term, the better, essentially. The healthier the system will be. If we can maintain lots of different organisms in those systems, we will have a healthier system. That we provide food, and we're not just providing food, we need to provide housing. We need to think about, we need to be aware of the interactions of the whole system with each other. Also, creating a healthy ecosystem in your landscape protects local watersheds, because it helps decrease water runoff by allowing water to be absorbed into the system. We filter the water before it reaches the water table. We help, prevent tremendous floods and things like that by slowing the water down. Essentially, that's what we're trying to do in many cases. Also, an active, healthy ecosystem will pull carbon out of the atmosphere. The atmosphere is our biggest carbon sink, it's referred to as. And if we're thinking about climate change, carbon in the air is one of our biggest issues. Carbon in the ocean, we won't even go there today, but that's another problem. But carbon in the air, if you have a very healthy, active ecosystem in your landscape, that is pulling carbon out of the air and creating carbon-based molecules that then will eventually it gets stored into the soil. Complex science there, which we won't hit this morning, but trust me on that one. I don't know. you haven't met me before, but it's true. So just some organisms that many of us enjoy or love and might motivate us. Butterflies are particularly popular with people interested in native gardening, and they are very colorful. They're like the megafauna of our gardening, of our gardening work. These are so on the left we've got a spicebush swallowtail, and on the right we have another swallowtail called a giant swallowtail, and in between them is a much smaller little butterfly called an American copper. So those are just some lovely examples. The giant swallowtail on the right, that's a butterfly that has moved north. That is a southern butterfly that we now see in New England quite regularly. But even 15, 20 years ago, it was unusual. Bees. Now, bees are a huge issue. Some people are terrified of them. Some people conflate bees and wasps, but native bees are a very important resource in our ecosystems, and they are not dangerous. Native bees are not aggressive, in particular, unless you walk up and smack them. They tend to be very calm and go about their business and leave you be. So they're not a bee that we need to worry about, and that we want to encourage them. Down in the lower left is a common eastern bumblebee, very common. When you are outside and you see a fuzzy bee, you're most likely seeing a common eastern bumblebee. There are several different species. This is a different kind of bumblebee. This is a Bombus perplexus, a confusing bumblebee. And then we have two other native bees on the right, top and bottom, you can see, I'm going to turn on my laser pointer here. See if that helps you visualize what I'm talking about. You can see that this bee has got tons of pollen on its hind leg. This bee, not so much. This is a different kind of a bee, but there are hundreds of species of native bees that are very important pollinators and thus important to the success of many different plants in our local systems. And dragonflies and damselflies, another sort of megafauna of insects that most people love, and you can encourage these in your local landscapes. They do need water for their nymphal stages. They lay eggs and their youth stages, their teenage years, which are only months for them, but weeks, are in water. This is actually one dragonfly eating another dragonfly. They are excellent predators and will consume things like mosquitoes and stuff like that. So they're a beautiful group of insects that most people like. Now, for many of us, the big megafauna of our local landscapes are birds, and birds need food. Birds need caterpillars, and by creating a sustainably aimed landscape of natural plants, we encourage caterpillars, and birds need caterpillars. So that's our connection to birds in terms of our landscape. Basically is shelter and caterpillars. A lot of caterpillars. Takes a lot of, it takes well, we'll talk about that. So in terms of best practices, think of your landscape not as, oh, I like these flowers, I'm going to put them here, or I like this color, or whatever. Think of your landscape as habitat. You are providing food, you're providing shelter. Ideally, there's some water. I have a very small yard. It's less than 1/4 of an acre. It's a tiny little space in a town with yards that are much bigger in general. It's basically completely native. I have this tiny little area of lawn that my husband mows it because he wanted some space without, with grass. But in general, I have native shrubs and trees and wildflowers, and I have just a tremendous array of birds and insects that utilize my yard. And I don't have water because right near me, I have water that I have a little brook that's no more than 25 yards away. So I don't worry about supplying them with water. And in general, you don't need to supply water unless you are truly in an area with none. So that's something to think about. And we'll talk about water more at the end. Now, as I said, you need a variety of structure. You need different things. You need some trees, some shrubs, ideally some trees, some shrubs, some vegetation, some perennial herbaceous stuff, and you can add annuals. But annuals are important in the Northeast. In some areas, in particular where it's cold, to get blooms early in the season. We don't have a lot of things that bloom really early, so you might want to throw in some annuals in your landscape so that you have some nice blooms very early on. Predominantly, 90% ideally plus native plants and minimal lawn. Those are best practices. That's sort of the goal. You don't have to get there at the first minute you start, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. So the thing about habitat, let me go back to that first one, is habitat. A good habitat supplies food, shelter, water, all the things that an organism needs to survive. It doesn't just give them nectar plants. It gives them host plants for the caterpillars, for instance, when we're talking about butterflies. So that's something that we will come back to. We will talk about the aspects of habitat and your yard. So think of your yard as an ecosystem. If you can do that, if you can focus on an ecosystem, what are you providing? Does your ecosystem have all the elements of a healthy ecosystem? When you think about it, here we have a simple food web, and a food web is exactly what it sounds like. The sunlight supplies the energy, and then we have the producers, the plants down here at the bottom, represented by this sort of sunflower looking graphic, and that plant then supplies food and energy to a numerous diverse group of organisms, and then some of those, eat those organisms, and then we have birds that eat those organisms, and then we even have some birds that eat birds, or birds that eat mice, or we're missing things that are pretty common in most of our yards or landscapes, such as chipmunks and stuff like that. Fox, snake, voles, amphibians, a frog or a toad, stuff like that. They're not all here, but you get the picture, is that this is all very, very interconnected. Here we have a great picture of a this is some kind of a jumping spider, a bull jumping spider probably, making a meal out of a fly. It looks like it's probably a technid fly, and in a flower. So that spider was waiting in the flower for some organism that came to pollinate or nectar on the flower, and then trapped it. And there you go. That's true. Flies are often excellent pollinators, but another topic. There's so many topics here. It's going to be hard to keep us moving in a linear fashion, but I will try to stick with it. I'm just checking my time. Okay. Now, so food we talked about, and we'll talk more about food in a minute, but structure. Think about what kind of layers are in the habitat. Edge is, for most of us, because we live in an area where we do have some open space and we need to have some lawn area, that think about what the edge of that lawn area is like. Think about the trees, or the vegetation underneath the trees, or the shrubby layer. You need to have all those layers, and all of those different structures. You can have coniferous or evergreen plants in here. You can have deciduous plants in here, and what works best in your area, and what you enjoy. Don't dismiss what you like as well as what's good for the ecosystem, because you can hit both. If once you start looking and working on this. This is a fairly young landscape. We don't have a lot of big mature trees. There's some back here, but it's all a work. Nature is a work in progress, right? We're all a work in progress. Here's a different type of structure, a more meadowy structure. If you want open space, but you don't actually need the lawn, then aiming for meadow habitat is a terrific thing to do. We don't have a lot of good meadows in most of our areas, because we have trees and we have lawns for the most part. That landscapers tend to focus on the big trees and maybe some shrubs, and then the mowed areas for human use. So if you have a space that can be converted from lawn to meadow, that'd be great. Then some shrubs around the edges are always good, both for shelter and for sitting spaces for the birds that will come to eat the insects that are here in this nice blooming meadow. Think about flowers. Think about the shape and the use and the timing of your flowers. I know it seems a little complicated, but there are different shapes of flowers are utilized by different types of organisms. Here's this is a skipper of some kind, and with its proboscis in a milkweed flower, right? So it's not just monarchs, right? Milkweeds are good because of the way they bloom. Lots of blooms that repeat, that keep opening sequentially. Sorry. And then here's a hummingbird on a hyssop, which is a long, deep, tiny little flower, and the hummingbird tongues are perfect for that. So this is a plant that appeals to hummingbirds and other long-tongued organisms. There are some long-tongued bees and butterflies, things like that. And again, because you have sequential blooming of all these tiny little blossoms that bloom, it offers them many opportunities for nectaring. Basically, remember that nectar is the bribe. The flower creates nectar as a bribe for the pollinator. The flower is not utilizing that nectar. The nectar is produced so that the organism, the fly, the bee, the butterfly, bird, whatever it is, that's coming to drink that nectar, actually picks up some pollen and delivers it to the next flower that it, like this hummingbird will move to another hyssop or even move to a different flower on this hyssop. And it will carry pollen from one flower to another. And so that what the flower is trying to do is get that pollinator to carry pollen. And they offer the nectar as a food source, as an energy source, as a whatever. And so it's a bribe. What the flower is really interested in is getting the pollen moved from flower to flower, from plant to plant. Okay, and then here's different types of flowers. Here's a flower that you have to be sort of a big sturdy creature in order to get into this flower. So it's perfect for a lot of our native bees, some of our bigger native bees. This is a native bee that the pollen carrying capacity is on the base of the abdomen. So that's kind of cool. This is a leafcutter bee. But so a lot of our native bees, they can push their way in, the bumblebees and stuff like that. And they can get in there and collect the pollen and retrieve the nectar. These big flat ray flowers, all of those flowers that bloom like this, the flowers are actually millions of tiny little flowers in the middle of the rays, and they bloom sequentially again. So they offer lots of opportunity for the insects. They offer a good landing pad for the insects, so they're easy to access. So you have all different kinds of flower structure. There are a million different kinds of floral structures. And just think about offering a variety of floral structure, both through through different types of plants and different times of blooming. So in my mind, the two most successful flower shapes, or the two most, the kind of the ones to focus on, are those that lots of tiny flowers, either in a, on a raceme like this, on a tall stem, or on a ray like this. But those that produce lots of tiny little flowers that will bloom sequentially are really good generalist flowers to think about. And you want to think about seasonality. Flowers are important throughout the season, but there are different kinds of food that are important throughout the season. On the left here, we have an oriole in probably it's a crabapple, which is not a native plant, but you can't have everything. So this oriole may in fact be collecting insects. Orioles do like nectar, but they collect insects to feed their hatchlings. All birds around here, all of the songbirds that live in, that we see in the spring, they're collecting insects. Insects are a really good food source to feed your babies. You've got lots of good protein in there. And so it's good stuff to grow on, and you need insects, you need those caterpillars. So it's entirely feasible that this oriole is collecting caterpillars out of there. But this is a plant that blooms early, so it's good for early pollinators. It's good for the early season pollinators. We have a bee balm on the right hand side. That's a summer blooming plant. I noticed the other day my bee balm is opened, and it will bloom from now through a good part of the summer. It will repeatedly bloom, and so that's a good summer blooming, food source, and it will bring hummingbirds. If you plant bee balm, you will get hummingbirds, I guarantee. This is a female ruby-throated hummingbird. For those of us in the Northeast, this is 99% of the time, this is the only hummingbird you will see is a ruby-throated hummingbird. And this is a female because it has no ruby throat. Now, in the left here, I found this picture in our image library, and this to me is just, this is like this sort of describes the ecosystem in miniature. This one picture right here. This is fall. The leaves are turning. We've got fruit we've got lots of fruit. You can see here's an eastern bluebird that's consuming one of the berries. You can see that there's damage to the leaves. Notice the coloration is is interrupted. I'm sorry, it's not very in focus, but you can see, and that damage indicates that this has been a food source for many insects throughout the season. Hasn't harmed the plant, but we've got lots of different caterpillars that have been able to utilize this particular plant as a food source. And those caterpillars then are food source for somebody else. And also up here in the very top left, you see that pointed little thing sticking out the end of the stem. That is next year's flower bud. So here we are. This is probably September, maybe early October in the life of this. This is a flowering dogwood, a native flowering dogwood, Cornus Florida. And you can't, in my mind, you couldn't pick a better small tree to put in your landscape. I'd be hard pressed to come up with one that I think is better. The fruit is very nutritious for these birds that consume it, and the flowers will open in the spring and be utilized by spring pollinators. The leaves support many different kinds of insects. So, here is, ecosystem in miniature right here in this one plant. I love this. And we'll actually touch on this later when we're talking more about native plants in a couple slides. This is winter, and we have lots of songbirds that overwinter with us. And so trees offer them good shelter. This is a birch, so these are next season's catkins, and they can find some food in there. This is a winter goldfinch, so it's not yellow. But so think of seasonality, think of supplying both shelter and food throughout the seasons as well as you can. Again, going back to the best practices in terms of winter, the best thing you can do in the winter is do not clean the yard. Leave the stems, leave the seed heads on the stems, leave the leaves on the ground. All of these things supply food and shelter. Many of our overwintering insects overwinter as a pupa. They don't overwinter, some pupal stage, cocoon, chrysalis, think that concept. And they do so inside of a stem, inside of the, under the leaf litter, all of these things. And so for our insects, most of which we want to encourage, the vast majority of insects are beneficial insects or useful insects in the ecosystem. They are not pathogens or pathogenic. So we want to encourage our insects, and the best thing you can do to encourage your insects is to give them places to overwinter. Overwinter is the sort of our defining season, right? You have to get through winter to take advantage of what we have right now. But it's getting through winter that's the hard part. And you can see that all of this disruption in the snow, there's been lots of birds coming to feed on the seed heads of this probably a rue, I think this is, just the seed heads that were left there. So resist cleaning your yard. If you're one of those people who wants to clean the yard, then restrain yourself. I work with a woman who is in charge of some of our beds up by our admissions area, and she constantly wants to clean them, and I have to rein her in because it's just this is very important. Winter. This is a white-throated sparrow, scavenging through the leaf litter. So there you go. Best practice. You need remember the pollination, nectar thing, and think about that in terms of what you choose to put out for flowers. Showy flowers that do not supply pollen or nectar are actually, they're of no functionality in an ecosystem. So this is an echinacea, sorry, just blanked on a coneflower. This is a coneflower as it normally would exist in the wild. And this is a cultivar of a coneflower. Now, not all cultivars are bad, but this cultivar, it has been, the modification is such that it has no anthers. It probably has no pistils. It does not have any male or female flower parts. Thus, it's producing no pollen and no nectar. And so while it may be fun to look at, it is not a resource. It is not a functional part of our ecosystem. A lot of times cultivars emphasize that showiness, that, oh, look at this flower, because, we tend to just look at it for color and excitement. But be more critical in terms of what that flower is supplying for our local wildlife when you're looking at it. Let me just checking my time. We're doing well. Okay. The other thing that is very hard for some people is leaf litter. Leaf litter is one of the best things we can have. It is a totally natural resource when you live in a biome like ours. We live in the deciduous forest biome, the eastern deciduous forest. So we have lots and lots of leaves. Utilize them. Let them fall and stay under your shrubbery. You can even leave them on your lawn if you can bring yourself to it. Most people can't, but there's no reason to remove the leaves. And as I said, there are lots of things that overwinter in that leaf litter. Bumblebees in particular. Bumblebees are something that people tend to be drawn towards, and they need that, a lot of our native bees, not all of them, but they need that leaf litter in order to get through the winter. Plus, they are natural weed suppressants, and as they decompose, they fertilize the ground. I can't stress this enough, that I've even seen now some little campaign slogan things called "Leave the Leaves." So that's our campaign slogan for the day. If nothing else, is leave the leaves. I admit that I have a son-in-law who has a yard that is pristine. I cannot get him to let the leaves lie. He rakes out the leaves and puts them in the they go to the compost at the dump, and then he puts on bark mulch. He puts on dyed bark mulch. I admit it's like painful to me, but I can't get him to stop, and I'm not, because he says it looks messy. So that's what most of us have been working with for many years, is that it looks messy. And my yard definitely, compared to many of my neighbors, is messy, but I've also influenced 2 neighbors near me to stop using bark mulch. I feel like I'm compensating for my son-in-law, but I've got two neighbors interested in creating better habitat and yards, and they no longer use bark mulch. So I feel like I've made some progress. It's an ongoing battle. And in terms of, to continue that conversation of how we include, or how we improve our habitats, is use of native plants. Native plants are those plants that are normally found in this space that we live in, whatever your space is. If you're in New England, then our vast array of native plants are pretty similar. Sorry, that's my phone dinging. I've got to turn that off. You will support a vastly greater amount of animal diversity. Native plants are what most of our butterflies need a native plant, not to nectar in necessarily. You may see a butterfly come and collect nectar off a totally introduced flower, but it needs native plants to lay its eggs on and to feed its larvae, the caterpillars. Most caterpillars require native plants to turn, to live their juvenile stages in order to become an adult. So you will influence your ecosystem tremendously by the use of native flowering plants rather than introduced flowering plants. And it doesn't need to be directly. I mean, there's some people who say if it wasn't in North New England, 500 years ago, then you can't plant it here. And that I don't go with that. There are lots of plants from the mid-Atlantic that do very well here. And as our climate shifts and we get warmer, certainly, and they still support most of our native wildlife. But just think about, and once you get them established, native plants take care of themselves. I do very little work in my yard, and I have a constant array of flowering perennials and flowering shrubs and fruit and all kinds of things going on here that I don't have to fuss with. There's very little fussing once you get a good native garden established. So, and here we have, this is an Asclepias tuberosa, a butterfly weed, not a butterfly bush. That is an introduced plant that we do not recommend at all because it will escape. And it's a nuisance plant when it escapes. So butterfly weed, though, is a native plant, and it grows very easily. And it's a very supportive. Here we have several different native bees on here, the out of focus in the back, and this lovely coral hair streak in focus in the front. So there you go. Native plants. You know, as I said, you've got to have the caterpillars. The caterpillars have to have those native leaves. And without the caterpillars eating the native leaf, here's an inchworm on an oak leaf, and you know, here's a chickadee looking for its next meal. And you can see that there are lots of insects have been eating these leaves and using these leaves. And these plants, the plants evolved with these insects. Native plants evolved with our native insects, and so they're not in opposition all the time. They often work together. They encourage each other because they are beneficial to each other, or they're at least not pathogenic. But so don't worry so much if you see some native damage on an otherwise healthy looking plant. So I love this picture. So this is a barn swallow, and you know, feeding its young. I believe that's a dragonfly that is springing in. So we need insects in order to have birds. We need insects, and all these birds require lots of insects. Somebody, I don't know who studied this, but the estimate is that a pair of chickadees need 6,000 caterpillars to raise, you know, to raise a nest of hatchlings until they fledge. Here's another statistic: 300 caterpillars a day brought by eastern bluebirds. So if you don't have any bugs, you don't have any birds. You won't have those baby birds supported. These two here this is a pair of wood thrushes in there waiting patiently for the parent to come back with some food. These are the groups. Oaks in particular, the cherries, the wild, you know, like black cherries or pin cherries. There's many different kinds of, there's several different kinds of cherries and lots of different kinds of birches and willows. These are woody plants, woody trees and shrubs that support a lot of caterpillar diversity. Although dogwoods I would throw in there too. Now that I didn't put it in, but there you go. Now here we're back. This is back to our dogwood conversation of the picture that I had of the bluebird eating the berry. This is our native flowering dogwood on the right, and this is an introduced Kusa dogwood on the left. The Kusa comes from Asia, and it was promoted starting back. I mean, it's been around for a while, but I think starting back in the 80s and the 90s, maybe it was promoted as the tree. You didn't want to have, don't plant flowering dogwoods because they might get a disease called anthracnose and they'll die. Plant these Kusa dogwoods because they'll bloom, they'll be beautiful, the blooms last forever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, now the thing is that how many caterpillars are supported by an introduced Kusa dogwood? And given my harangue for the morning, I bet you can guess it. Zero species of native caterpillars can use the Kusa dogwood as a host plant. For the flowering dogwood, it's 117. So just by that one choice of using planting a flowering dogwood, a Kusa florida rather than a Cornus florida rather than a Cornus Kusa, you've made a huge impact on your local ecosystem. So 117 species of caterpillars during the summer. And then when we look at the fruit, here's the Kusa fruit, which looks like a giant pudgy raspberry kind of thing, actually tastes like a mango. You can eat it because it is a fruit designed to attract monkeys in its native habitat or its native ecosystems. Kusas utilize monkeys are the seed vector for Kusa dogwood. So this is a fruit that is aimed at attracting primates. And so it actually tastes good to us. However, as opposed to the flowering dogwood, our native flowering dogwood, which produces a berry that is very nutritious and attractive to birds and comes out in like September and October when their food resources are diminishing and they might need some food, some good food resources before they migrate. So the whole thing is based around, you know, how that tree, it relates to everything else, right? So that's just a really clear-cut example of a easy choice to make, and one that has significant repercussions in the effectiveness of your habitat. Here's another one, Bradford pear. Luckily has become a tree that is not utilized as much, but it was highly utilized for a long time and still still popular. I mean, you'll still see a lot of it. It blooms and it's gorgeous when it blooms. And other than that, it has very little habitat impact. It's not a resource. If you look at the leaves of a Bradford pear, there's nothing eats that Bradford pear. Here on the right, we have our native sugar maple. And by the end of the season, the leaves have been eaten and chewed and utilized, and this native sugar maple will support all kinds of insects and supply all kinds of habitat resources that the Bradford pear just can't even come close to. Okay, I can't give you a good list. Here's just, you know, for 2 seconds. Robert, I know will send out the link so that you can come back and look at the resource list, which will be at the end. And I recommend that if you really want to look at the, you know, to set up a good set of plants for you to utilize. But we have lots of flowering, fruiting shrubs. 9-bark is good. However, there are mostly you will find cultivars of 9-bark, which I do not recommend. The cultivars are long story. We won't go into it, but the cultivars are not locally produced cultivars and thus are really not functional as a habitat resource. So only if you can find straight species 9-bark would I recommend 9-bark. And the local Cornus, both Cornus Florida and Cornus, which have a different, they're in different genera now, but we still refer to them all as Cornus, all our shrubs, all our dogwood shrubs, as well as our dogwood tree. And viburnums are another one, although they have their issues now with some introduced pests. Native grasses, native sedges, native violets. There are lots of native violets. And then, you know, just the variety of flowering perennials that will take you from early spring all the way to the last of the hard frosts. This is in chronological order, spring to late. So, but again, we won't dwell on that right now. Just some images of some of these, you know, in terms of the variety of flowers and colors and blooms that you will get. They're just, I mean, this isn't a great showy flower, but it's beautiful. Spotted bee balm is beautiful. So, you know, you just have to appreciate life in a different realm. Bird feeders and bee feeders, we like to call. Some of these plants are really good in terms of, like, this is a blueberry. This is probably a high bush blueberry, I would say. And the flowers are really good for the bees. They are really good pollinator plants in terms of feeding the pollinators. And then, you know, once they get pollinated, they produce a berry that is a great food resource. If you're lucky, you can get a few off of them. I never do. I have several high bush blueberries in my yard, and just when I think that they're ripe enough to pick, maybe in a day or two, the birds take them all. They're gone. You know, so I feel like they need them more than I do. And I'm happy to supply that resource. But just think of utilization by multiple types of wildlife. when you start looking at, especially at your shrub and tree layers. So again, back to our list. This is the list we had a few slides back, because now we're going to talk about the lawn part on this list, the minimal lawn part. And this is often the hardest bit for people because we are so used to lawns. Lawns were invented as a means of showing that how much space you had that you didn't have to utilize it for a practical purpose. You didn't have to plow it up and plant vegetables. You didn't have to have it as an orchard. You had so much property. It's true that it's a landscape invention, a lawn. You had so much property that you could afford to just have it be a lawn. And so it comes out of a landscape tradition that comes to us from England. Towards the late 1800s, and basically it was just a means of displaying your wealth. And so it is not, when we're considering green in terms of the ecological impact, lawns are definitely not green. And the same son-in-law with the bark mulch, he is constantly putting herbicides and fertilizers on his lawn, and I kept telling him that clover growing up through the grass is great. If you let the little white clover grow, and you will supply some food value with that for pollinators. Nope, can't. No, he doesn't want any of it. He wants that perfect sort of turf grass look. But because they are poorly adapted for virtually all climates, except where those grasses come from, that they require constant support. Fertilizing, which is a really, added, commercial fertilizers are not environmentally supportable in many ways. And certainly the herbicides and pesticides that most people put on their lawns, to kill the crabgrass or whatever, those are, whenever you're putting anything on to kill something, you need to be really cautious and judicious in the use of it and what you're doing. And they often require extra water. Even in a climate like ours, where we get, we are used to a certain amount of water, we still, people still have to irrigate their lawns. They water them. This is typical lawn and using using a landscaping company to mow the lawn. They often recommend and utilize a lot of synthetic herbicides and pesticides that are definitely not beneficial to our ecosystems. So what can you do? Most people, I'm not saying you have to get rid of your lawn. We're nowhere. We don't recommend that. We don't recommend making people miserable, but mow your lawn slightly higher rather than a really low lawn. Mow it a little longer. Mow it taller. The taller the taller the grass, the greater the height you keep the grass at, the better the root system will develop. And if you use a mulching lawnmower and you return those little grass clippings into the lawn, it will be good for the grass. It will be good for the soil. Go through and aerate, and use different grass mixes. There are now lots of mixes. They're not native plants, most of them, but they are grass mixes that have been introduced specifically for their tolerance to not needing herbicides and not needing irrigation. And they will grow slowly enough that they can grow up and don't need to be mowed constantly. There are a number of good grass mixes out there if you want to try to reconfigure your lawn. I highly recommend it. What you can do instead of the classic bluegrass and stuff like that. But the other thing to consider is where are there areas that you don't need there to be lawn? Rather than mowing the whole space, what can you do? Where can you get away with letting some of this grow up and be a meadow? So where will you not miss it? And what can you use for other ground covers if there are places where you still want it to be low? And then where are the places that you really need the lawn, where you're gonna play your ball games or put out your lawn chair, and how can you treat that area in a way that's more sustainable? And so that's the lawn issue, is just to think about integrating the lawn into the concept of native habitat ecosystems. It's not, I wouldn't, if you're just starting, I don't recommend starting with thinking, oh, I got to get rid of my lawn, because that's a heavy task. I recommend starting with, and we'll talk about that in a minute, starting differently. But there are native ground covers that you can put down that require far less maintenance, and that you can walk on them. You can mow them intermittently, 2 or 3 times in a season. They don't need a lot of mowing, but they will cover the ground with a green ground cover, and they will still support native wildlife. This is a Pennsylvania sedge, which actually fills in very nicely. It grows no more than 6 to 8 inches tall in general. Sometimes it'll get taller than that, but it's a tremendous host plant. Violets are a terrific host plant for a lot of different butterflies. And so all of these sort of low impact design elements are things to consider as you work your way into sort of lawn, gardening as to support wildlife. Now, water. Oh, I'm running out of time. So we'll run through water. Water and rain gardens, something to consider. Where can you slow down the water? Where can you capture the water? How do you build a rain garden? All of those things. That's an important aspect. Now here is an image of, this is outside of one of our sanctuaries in Worcester. And here's what it looks like now. And here's what it looked like before. There was just this, it was a swale that was meant to just capture water and not let it flow into the road as much. But you can see that with the native plantings, it has become a totally useful water garden, rain garden, which is, just leads us into, everything is a resource. It's not, you don't have to remove stuff. Don't take away the things you clip, use them. Let some parts of your yard be messy. Have the neat parts where you need them, and have the messy parts where you can utilize them. And this is the most important thing. It needs to be sustainable for you to do, right? It needs to be, don't try to take on the whole task at once. Take on bits, take on parts, take on, putting in some native perennials, whatever works for you as a focus that will help you be engaged and will allow you to engage in the process and be doable for you. But aim for this, this is, native perennials are a pretty low bar to step into. And having some native perennial areas in a landscape, that's a great place to start. This is an issue in that many of the plants that are available in commercial nurseries, especially places like Home Depot and stuff like that, have already been treated, particularly with neonicotinoids, which are really bad things, and we don't want them. So try to make sure that when you are buying even a native plant, that it has not already been treated with some sort of pesticide. Leave the leaves, and advocate for insects. Our advocacy department is always telling us that we need to tell people to join, make their voices heard. We do not need to spray. In Massachusetts, we spray indiscriminately for triple E, and in most communities, it's just not, it's not functional. There's no data to support that spraying for mosquitoes actually has an impact on the number of cases of triple E. So there you go. But and then 2 books by Doug Tallamy, who is I believe he's retired now, but he was at the University of Delaware. And these are great books. If you want to read about if you want to read to be inspired, I recommend Doug's books. They're great. They're very, very accessible, but how you can support wildlife. That's what both of these books are all about. And then here's a resource list, which Robert, you can, when you get the link tomorrow, you'll have time to pull, to have this slide up for you, and you can actually utilize these resources. This one at the bottom just came to me this morning, actually, from a colleague. This is the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, and there is a list in there I didn't go through. I just wanted to put this up here. So you guys, there's a very long list of resources. And so I haven't vetted any of them, but I presume the Department of Agriculture did. So hopefully, but it just looked like a really impressive list. So there we go. That's our last slide for the day. I'm going to stop my screen share. I'm going to stop my, there we go.
All right, Tia. So Tia, we have 20, and my phone rings the minute I unmute. So Tia, we have 20 questions for you. And
Okay.
folks, so we're gonna consolidate questions. And if you have any additional questions, you want to get them into the Q&A now. And we're going to do our best. Tia, what do you think? 10 minutes of questions? Does that work for you?
I'm happy. I'm happy if people are willing to stay a few minutes longer. I can do 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
Easily.
Excellent. And we are recording if anyone needs to drop off early, but I will try to address as many questions as we can in 15 minutes. Catherine's and Tia, I know you gave me permission to stop you, but I did not want to ask any questions. We just kept the flow going and you were able to finish in an hour, so that worked out well. So Catherine asks, I leave my leaves down on my perennial gardens in the fall. In the spring, I rake and use an electric shredder to shred the leaves and respread them as mulch. I always wonder when in the spring is the best time to rake and shred. What is the earliest I can do it without disturbing the bugs?
Excellent question, Catherine. So the first thing I would say is you don't need to collect them and shred them. They will decompose on their own. They will not inhibit your perennials. You may find that some have to, need a little encouragement to grow up through them, but I highly recommend not taking them in and shredding them and putting them back. Just let them go. Save yourself the effort. But in terms of the timing question of like when people want to cut down the dead stems from last year, and pick up stuff like that, I would say you want to wait until the days are usually 50 degrees. So for most of, depending on where you are, north to south, it's sometime in April. But you want consistent, by the time the days are consistently 50 degrees, most of your insects will have emerged.
An anonymous attendee asks, what about carpenter bees? Should we exterminate them if they have burrowed nests in our homes? Follow-up question, how do we get rid of carpenter bees so they don't do damage to the house without an exterminator so they can keep pollinating?
There you go. Okay, carpenter bees are always an issue. And the thing to remember about carpenter bees is they do not burrow into the grain of the wood, they burrow into the end grain only. So what they are using mostly are exposed rafter tails, and you need to keep them painted. If you keep a layer of paint or some kind of product that protects your wood. I'm sorry, I just lost the vocabulary there. But if you keep your wood, the end grain of your wood protected, they cannot get into they will not go through that. So you just need a good layer of paint or stain or whatever is on your house over the end grain of your wood. And so
varnish, is that
varnish would work if you've got a varnish on your house, stain, whatever it is that protects the wood of your house, just make sure your end grain is covered. And they won't, because that's how they get in, is they find exposed wood. They need exposed wood. They won't go through the paint or the varnish or whatever.
Tia, I should come clean and tell you I know nothing about gardening, and I'm going to definitely mispronounce some words in some of these questions here. So next up is Sally. She says, our yard gets almost no sun, so we don't have too many flowers. Mostly hoistas, I might be mispronouncing that, ground cover, trees, stuff like that. A few hanging flowers. Is there anything we can do to encourage birds? We put a hummingbird feeder out a few years back and got no activity.
Right. You probably don't have enough. I mean, if all you can grow are hostas, then I encourage you to go to the resource list and look specifically for shade growing natives, because hostas are again not supplying any functionality to an ecosystem. And again, if you don't have the hummingbirds need to have other resources around them. They need to have other flowers. So, if you've got any sunny edges or even partly sunny, partly, part sun, part shade, you can get some good flowering, fruiting shrubs and other plants. But I encourage you, go to those resource lists and focus on the shady resources, because they're out there.
An anonymous attendee asks, is there a good way to manage ticks naturally?
No. You know, ticks are what they are. If you are in an area that has a lot of ticks, one thing I know that some people do when they have when they abut a wooded area that has a lot of deer or field mice, deer mice and field mice are probably a bigger issue than deer themselves. But they put in a strip. They leave a bare strip. They take it down to the ground, nothing growing there, and put on, you know, like a layer of wood chips, just to separate their yard from the wooded area that in which the ticks are probably. But that's a specific circumstance. But if you are finding ticks in your yard, then you probably do need to consider keeping things lower, keeping your grasses lower. And no, I don't know of any effective natural tick controls, unfortunately. Climate change is another huge issue for ticks. That's why they're.
An anonymous attendee asks, for various reasons, we haven't cleaned up our yard or removed any leaves for the last couple of years. When I raked up a bunch recently, there was no grass or anything beneath the leaves, just dirt. Is that normal?
It is if what you had below it was a non-native turf grass. If you know, so actually you've taken out what is one of the hardest steps for many people, which is to clear the area, you know. But my guess is if you remove those leaves and just leave that ground exposed, things will start to grow. Whether they're things you want or not, that's a different question. But yeah, turf grass lawns do not grow through leaf cover, but native ground covers can grow through leaf cover.
An anonymous attendee asks, I have a lot of Oriental bittersweet growing in a part of my yard. What can I plant that will fight its spread and thrive?
Okay, so nothing will fight Oriental bittersweet. I will say that right off the bat. But the things that you can plant in there that would grow sort of with the Oriental bittersweet, and then you try to control it. If you control the Oriental bittersweet, just keep cutting it. If nothing else, you can dig it out, but if you keep cutting it, but if you plant things like Virginia creeper, which is on local native vine, you know, other good ground covers, you can inhibit it from coming back. But there's nothing that will. It's just so aggressive. Nothing native can compete particularly.
Jamie asks, I read somewhere that a 100% clover lawn is not recommended. I see what you recommended is a mix of grass and clover. Can you explain more about why 100% clover is not ideal?
That's a lawn specialist question, which I don't really know the answer to. My inclination is that it's because of the life cycle of the clover, that when the clover dies back, that you want other things growing there. You want to keep the ground covered to discourage weeds and other things that you don't want growing there. So that's what I presume, is that you mix the clover into other plants. The clover is actually fertilizing because it keeps nitrogen. You know what I'm trying to say, if you're with me on that one. But so yes, I agree that probably 100% clover, because it will die away and leave you with exposed ground, and then you'll just get weeds.
So Jeanette asks, do you have a list of native plants? And would that be something that we'd want to consult those sources on that last slide of yours, or where would you suggest folks get a list of native plants?
So that's exactly what I suggest, is to go to the resources on that last slide in terms of finding good native plant lists. And if you're in New England and you're looking for resources for native perennials, in particular the flowering perennials, then the one I realized that's not on that list is Native Plant Trust. Native Plant Trust is our local sort of. And there are a number of nurseries around that now are much more, that are completely focused on native plants. And I don't have a list of those, but yeah, go to that resource list.
Ruth asked, you might have touched on this at the very end. Ruth asks, is there a problem with using bark mulch. So is there a problem with using bark mulch?
So there are a few things with bark mulch. One is that it doesn't supply it inhibits habitat, it inhibits the ground habitat, it inhibits all those organisms that need to be protected at ground level. If you're buying bark mulch, you can be introducing things that you wouldn't be in your yard. It will often introduce a lot of fungi, not that that's generally problematic, but because of the way bark mulch decomposes, it's so dense and solid that it doesn't supply those air spaces, those living spaces that are necessary for the organisms that live in that leaf litter, in that top layer of soil.
An anonymous attendee asks, what is the species name of the native flowering dogwood? Do you know that one?
It's easy. It's the state of Florida. It's Cornus, Florida. I don't know why it's called Cornus, Florida. I can't remember the origin of the word Florida, but that's it. Our native flowering dogwood tree is Cornus, Florida.
All right, here's where I'm going to embarrass myself even more. So we're going to talk about some specific species here. And Paula wants to know, is Heleniathus, Helianthis, is that good for the natural landscape?
Helianthus are fine. There's a whole group of plants, the Helianthus, the Heliopsis, and there are definitely native species in those genera. And they are, you know, they're sort of those native, they're the perennial sunflower group is what they're called. And yeah, they're fine. They're good.
Martha asks about peonies. They're showy, but are they a good choice?
No, peonies are beautiful. Peonies are, they are not native and they really don't supply, they don't supply any resources. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having a few peonies in your yard. You know, I actually have some peonies in my yard that somebody gave me decades ago, and they're very pretty. And
Paula is wondering about sheep sorrel, sorrel. Is that a good choice?
Sheep sorrel is fine. There's nothing wrong with sheep sorrel. There's like a sheep laurel also, which is a shrub. That's a different plant, but and sheep laurel is fine too.
An anonymous attendee asks, if you have a totally wild yard, where should one start to keep it native but less messy looking?
So you can kind of control the types of plants you put in terms of going wild. You can also control the way you plant them. Like you can still plant in a very, you know, artful drift of perennials. You can have your perennials in groups. I do recommend planting some in groups, you know, like not just one bee balm, but you can plant your red bee balms in one area and your purple hyssop next to, you know, you can control the colors, you can do stuff like that. You can also, you know, you can clean up your edges a little bit. Mine is, you know, my neighbor actually came across the street and started to clean up the front of my yard one day because he couldn't stand it. But you know, so I understand the issue, but there are definitely ways to sort of, you don't have to have leaves falling out of the beds all the time and stuff like that. You can clean the edges, and you can organize your plantings in ways that are quite artful.
So Tia, I want to be respectful of your time, everyone else's time. I'll give you, let's go over 3 more minutes here. Mary asks, do gooseberries and currants provide for our birds and bees?
Gooseberries and currants can offer food. There's no question about that. The one thing I would say is that currants are not native. I believe there are some native gooseberries. I'm not sure about gooseberries, but currants also are an alternate. In Massachusetts, you cannot plant black currants. I believe currants are an alternate host for pine rust, for a condition that's detrimental to our white pine trees. So I do not recommend currants. There are actually some currants in our sanctuary in Lincoln. And I'm considering more and more that we should probably take them out. But because currants are an alternate host for at least some of the currants. And that, if you want more information on that, go to the MDAR website and put in currants and they'll tell you.
Hugh, this is more of a comment, but maybe you can react to it. Hugh says he's a fan of ground wood chips made by arborists. Is that something you would recommend?
I mean, we can have, we definitely local wood chips that are ground up, that are chipped when an arborist comes and removes a tree, especially if they're removing a tree on your facility. No reason not to keep those wood chips and use them. I'm not a fan of brought in anything just because it can introduce other issues. It can introduce pathogens. Mm-hmm. Not highly likely, but there you go. But certainly if somebody's cutting something on your yard, in your landscape, and you want to keep those wood chips, then go for it.
All right, so we're going to wrap it there. Catherine, you had multiple questions that I wasn't able to get to, so I do apologize, but we got to several of them. I want to thank several libraries who helped us promote the program. That includes Williamstown, West Newbury, Peabody, Medfield, Groton, Drake, Danvers, Georgetown, Haverhill, Newburyport, Concord, and Clinton. Also want to thank and most importantly, want to thank the Ashland Library and also the Tewksbury Garden Club for helping spread the word. There's a lot of nice comments in the chat, Tia. Tanya says thank you. Rochelle says thank you for hosting this presentation. And thank you, Tia, for all the great information. I learned so much. I'm doing some things correctly already and can now do even more. And Sherry says thank you. Hugh says thank you, Tia. He found it wonderful. So we will wrap it there. Tia, do you have any last words for the group?
No, just have fun with it. If anything seems too much of a chore, then back up and take a broader view.
All right, so Tia, thank you so much. We're going to see Tia in 2 months. She'll be back in August to give a talk about how we can coexist and live with, I believe is it animals, Tia?
Yeah, living with wildlife.
Living with wildlife in Massachusetts. All right, so you'll have information about that, plus the link to this recording, plus a link to a feedback survey emailed to you, if not later today, then first thing tomorrow. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Tia.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all for